Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 22nd meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I welcome members back to Parliament after the summer recess, welcome our witnesses and welcome all visitors in the gallery. And I can remind everyone please to turn off or at least turn to silent all electronic devices. Now, we have two new members joining us this morning. Can I welcome Mark McDonald and Hanzala Malik to the committee? And I would just like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to Rhoda Grant and David Torrance, who have left us for their work on the committee over the previous session and their contribution to all our debates. I need to ask the new members to declare any relevant interest to the work of the committee. I'll start with Mark McDonald.
Thank you, Convener. I would immediately direct members to my register of interests, but I don't believe I have any which are relevant to the committee.
Thank you. And Hanzala Malik.
Thank you, Convener. I don't believe I have any interest to declare other than the ones I've already declared in the register of interest.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, item 2, I would ask the committee to agree to take items 6 and 7 on the agenda in private. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, item 3 on the agenda, we're taking evidence from the Green Investment Bank, and I'd like to welcome Lord Smith of Kelvin, who's the chairman, Shaun, Kingsbury, chief executive, and Rob Comrie, who's the operations director. Thank you for coming along this morning to help us with our committee's work and deliberations. Before we get into questions, Lord Smith, do you want to say something by way of an introduction?
Yes, I would. Convener, many thanks for your introduction and your welcome. It's a great pleasure for us, genuinely, to be here, and we very much appreciate the committee's time and interest. I want to take the opportunity to introduce my colleagues and then offer an update on our progress during what's not yet a full year of operation. So sitting on my right is Chief Executive Shaun Kingsbury. Shaun joined us in November last year. He's held a number of senior global roles in the renewables industry. Sitting on my left is our Director of Operations, Rob Comrie. Rob has similarly many years of experience in our sector. Rob manages our day-to-day operations, including how we manage sustainability, our technical experts, communication, HR, property and IT. Most importantly for today, Rob is responsible for the Scottish project origination. I became chairman of GIB in May 2012. I'm also chair of Perth's SSE, about to depart my role as chair of Glasgow's Weir Group, and I'm chair of the Glasgow 2014 Commonwealth Games. So back to GIB, 1 year on, I believe we've made sound progress with two parts of our mission. The first part is helping to accelerate our transition towards a greener economy. We do that by investing in projects that are both green and profitable. Projects like offshore wind farms, large-scale waste recycling facilities, waste-to-energy facilities, and large-scale energy efficiency programmes. The types of large infrastructure projects that we need if we're going to achieve our demanding and legally binding environmental targets. Our involvement in these projects must be necessary to see them go ahead, so additionality is key, and we must make investments on a commercial basis, and we must crowd in other private sector capital. So this is a nuanced role, in part dictated by state aid rules set by the European Commission. So we've taken time across all our stakeholders to fully explain the role we can play. The second part of our mission is to build an enduring institution. We're not just here to invest the now £3.8 billion of government's capital, taxpayers' money, and move on. The challenge we face in financing our transition to a greener economy demands the type of institution that's here for the long haul, and that's what we're building. We are, of course, building the new institution with its headquarters here in Edinburgh. Indeed, we're indebted to many of you, Marco and amongst others, for your support for Edinburgh's successful bid. Last week, we moved into what will be our permanent headquarters in the heart of the city, and we made the move with a full complement of staff. We now total 80 members of the team, 31 in Edinburgh headquarters, and the remainder in our transaction hub in London. Edinburgh is home to our headquarter functions, so there we have risk, finance, legal, sustainability, technical, communications, HR and operations, and it's also home to one of our 3 investment banking teams, the energy efficiency team. We've been made very welcome by the wider Edinburgh community, and we've recruited well, bringing in some homegrown talent as well as attracting talent from across the world. And I believe our experience has proved the assertions set out in the Edinburgh bid that this city is already a hub of global financial talent and it's an attractive destination for talent working elsewhere. Because we're headquartered in Scotland, and as a Scot myself, I've been particularly keen to ensure that Scotland secures at least, if not more than, its fair share of our investment capital. And I'm afraid we've not seen that come through yet and have so far only invested in a small project at Tomatin Distillery. However, we have a number of positive prospects in the pipeline which we're dedicating ourselves to pulling through. I'm proud of what we're achieving at the Green Investment Bank. The challenge is to build our economy on a low-carbon footing, and as we do it, to capture as many of the benefits for the wider economy as we can. If we do that, we create new sustainable growth, and nowhere is that opportunity greater than in Scotland. We grew up complaining about the weather. Now we have a chance to put it to work for us. I believe that GIB is well set up to help realise this opportunity. We can do it by both green and commercial. I hope that's a useful introduction. We're ready now for questions.
Thank you very much, Lord Smith. A number of issues I think members will want to cover. I think we're interested in exploring the issue around the pipeline of projects and what's coming through. I think we want to look at issues around borrowing powers, how you can support community projects, issues around the Edinburgh headquarters and its footprint here, issues around and governance and issues around risk and borrowing. So there's a whole range of things I think we want to cover. We've got about an hour. We might run a little bit longer than that if there's time, but I would just ask members if they would to keep their questions short and to the point and focused, and if we could have answers that are as focused and to the point, that would be very helpful too. I think we're going to start off looking at this question of the pipeline of projects that you mentioned, and I'll bring in Dennis Robertson with the first question.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Before we go into the pipeline of projects, Lord Smith, you said in your introduction, and thank you very much for that introduction, that you're perhaps maybe slightly disappointed at the lack of investment, and obviously you mentioned the Tomatin Distillery. Do you think there's any reason why it's been slow, the uptake? I know you're still quite young in some respects, but is there any reason that you could put your finger on why the investment's been so poor?
No, I honestly don't think there is. I think it's just as it happens, but we've got quite a pipeline. You'll be hearing a bit of detail on that as we get further into things. But there's been no lack of enthusiasm. Central governments, local authorities, and certain organisations who are in this space. So I don't think it's a Scottish worry that we've got at all. No.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you very much. With regard to the pipeline projects, could you perhaps, give us a little bit more detail what's in the pipeline and how confident you are that it is going to progress?
Okay, I think that's your role.
Yeah, let me start. Let me give you a little bit of background about the types of things we're looking for, and then when we get into the detail of the projects, I think Rob, given that that's your main focus, or best place to answer it. The size of the challenge in Scotland and across the UK as a whole is huge, and that's one of the reasons that maybe we haven't got off to a very quick start here in Scotland. Across the UK as a whole, we need to invest close to £200 billion in the next 10 years to hit the targets which are legally binding. So if you look at that on an annual basis, just divide by 10, £20 billion a year, we'd need to be investing. And the run rate that we have at the moment is 25 to 30% of that, £2.5 to £3 billion a year, rather than £10 billion a year. And we're looking for projects that have to fulfill our double bottom line. They have to be profitable. So if there's one thing you take away from my discussion and comments this morning, we're a for-profits bank. We will make a return on that, a return on the taxpayers' money. But they also have to be green. And finding projects which are both green and profitable has been a challenge, particularly here in Scotland. The other area that causes us a challenge is this idea of additionality. What we're trying to do is to crowd in private sector money. Our role is to catalyse private sector investment. So if there are projects which already have enough financing, and there can be some of those who really don't need our money, we won't elbow our way into those transactions. There's no need for us. What we want to focus on is the green and profitable projects that are a little bit short of capital, that don't have enough capital, where maybe 70 or 80% of the capital, maybe 50 or 60% of the capital is available. We'll bridge the rest, whether they need debt or whether they need equity or some other type of financial support. And so we want to crowd in the rest of that money, not compete with the private sector to crowd it out. And Rob will talk a little bit about where we can invest. We can invest in debt or in equity, in mezzanine or in guarantees, as long as the returns are adequate. And some of the projects that we've seen throughout the UK, not particularly just here in Scotland, have been projects which are certainly very green but don't hit our profitability targets. They're not bankable, as it were. They're too early stage, or the profit margins aren't there, or the risks don't add up when you look at the potential returns. So Rob, maybe you can cover off the areas where we're focused on and what the pipeline looks like in Scotland.
No, delighted. I'll do it in two ways, if I may. The first one is, who do we engage with, just to make sure you understand who we're talking to, and that includes Scottish Enterprise, REEF, so the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, the Scottish Green Investment Portfolio, which was stimulated by the First Minister last year, and of course Scottish Futures Trust. All of those are a part of the team that we work with or we engage with to try and create opportunities. Some of those are focused in slightly smaller areas, like REEF. They tend to do slightly smaller projects, community projects, and some of the marine areas. Some of the others, SFT, is perhaps more in our sweet spot. And if you look at the sectors where our mandate allows us to invest, I'll split that into three. The first one is offshore wind. And if you look at who is investing or who may invest in due course, obviously through SSE, there's a big Beatrice project. There are projects up on the Moray Firth, which are sponsored by Repsol and EDP, so that shows some of the international investment. And also in the Forth with Mainstream Renewable Power, it's an Irish sponsor, but they're with a very large base in Scotland. So those offshore projects fit in our mandate, and we will seek to work with them over the next year or two. But I think to be clear, these are not happening today. These are in the next 1, 2, 3 years. The second section would be the energy efficiency, and Robert's already said that iBanking team is based here, so the focus is here. A couple of areas. One, the obvious one, which has been in the press, street lighting. We think there's a great opportunity for Scotland and elsewhere to reduce their emissions through that sort of programme, and to the extent we can be involved, we'd obviously be delighted. The second one is looking at the estate of Scotland, and the biggest, I'm not sure if it's the biggest one or not, but the NHS is an obvious example of a vehicle that is under the control, unlike England, is under the control of a single unit. And again, we're talking to them about how we might be able to work. The challenge for us is how you take 1,000 little projects and put them into a scalable project that we can really get engaged with. We just don't have the bandwidth otherwise. And then there are other ones in Glasgow, Sustainable Glasgow we're heavily involved with, and some district heating projects. The third bucket is around the waste and biomass area. And there are, split into two, there are some large waste projects in Edinburgh, and there's one in Clyde Valley. Again, one of those is, the Edinburgh one is a bit further forward, and the one in Clyde Valley is at earlier stage. And again, we will engage to see whether we can be additional, whether they are green and whether they are profitable. So those are very much on our list. Others would be on the biomass side. Estover, there are some virgin wood, small-scale virgin projects in the north, and obviously everyone will be aware of Grangemouth and other projects like that. They fit within our mandate. I won't particularly comment on individual ones, but to the extent they're in the mandate, they will be extensive DD and on making sure they are green and profitable. So the pipeline's there. We believe we're working with the right people. We'd obviously like to accelerate it. We'd love to do more, frankly. We'd like to get there quicker, but that's because we're impatient folk. But we believe we made a great start, and the future is good.
I'm hearing basically a lot of opportunity and a lot of potential. What I don't seem to be hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is what's actually in the pipeline now and what basically is there today in terms of investment that you're taking forward.
Start and then again to hand over to you, Shaun, and the totality. Just in case you've got the impression we haven't done any deals yet, apart from Tomatin, we actually invested £635 million in our first 5 months, and that crowded in other capital that took the total value of these things up to 2.3 billion. So actually there are 11 major transactions in there, and that includes putting some money into 4 funds to do smaller deals. So we haven't actually been idle in the first sort of 5 months to 31st March.
I'm not suggesting you've been idle. I was only suggesting that, basically I'm hearing about opportunities, potentials, but I wasn't hearing about something that's actually there in the pipeline now in terms of investment.
But just want to, we have put quite a lot of cash out already, but
Yeah.
Shaun.
And look, Rob, you touched on some of those things. The thing that I should just tell everybody, on average, it takes 3 to 4 years to develop one of these projects, from an idea to securing the land to getting the power purchase agreement and all of those things. So we're aware of £4 billion worth of transactions across the UK as a whole, but maybe only 500 million of those may be in a position to close. We can't give you the detail on specific things that we're very close to closing in the next, say, 6 to 12 months, because they're under confidentiality agreements. We've signed those. Those are commercially binding. And if we were to give you our opinion in a very public setting of where we thought this is a great project and this one, well, needs some work or something, we might find that folks don't bring us the information and they're very concerned around confidentiality. So we do have a pipeline of exactly the sort of projects that Rob talked about. Some of the ones he specifically mentioned, for example, the offshore wind and some of the biomass projects are real projects. They've said in the press that they're talking to folks about financing them, like the Green Investment Bank. So we feel comfortable putting those on the table. But a lot of the rest of the stuff, it takes a long time. Folks have shared stuff with us under NDA, and we feel, nervous about in any way giving commentary on their projects.
Thank you for that, and I know that other members have got several questions along where you are at the moment, so perhaps I'll just leave it there, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Just before I bring other colleagues in, can I go back, Lord Smith, something you said at the start? You talked about you wanted to make sure Scotland got its fair share of projects. What do you think a fair share is?
More than our population percentage, let's say, or GDP percentage, okay? I've got to be careful, because these things have to be green and profitable, and it's a legit organisation. But I would not want, in 2 years' time, to be turning around and saying we had only invested in Tomatin Distillery. And there's quite a lot in the pipeline in Scotland.
Yeah. But presumably, you don't, as a UK institution, presumably you have to be neutral in terms of different parts of the UK.
Absolutely.
So you're not, even though you're headquartered in Scotland, you're not able to say we're going to prefer Scottish projects.
Absolutely, you can't do that. It's got to be the best projects that we can do.
I think you did suggest that we've got more wind, perhaps, in Scotland to take projects forward.
Scotland
and
has
perhaps the marine environment too.
Scotland has 25% of potential European wind. It's got 25% of potential tide and 10% of potential wave. So there should be opportunities there.
Okay. Right. I think Chick Brodie wants to come in on this issue. Yeah. And then Hanzala Malik.
Just on that particular point, and really it's associated with, good morning, by the way. I'm sorry.
Good morning.
Associated with governance. I was concerned looking at the papers that Edinburgh has responsibility for, I believe, for asset management, and yet transactional operations are carried out under the auspices of London. How is all that circle squared? How can you help us with the actual management of the assets and the criteria for investment?
Yeah. So we have 2 offices, and it's actually great to be in both cities. What we've tried to do is to find the right balance between where we should put people and where the transactions are. And like it or not, a lot of transactions get done in London. That's where the lawyers are. That's where the other banks who co-invest with us are. That's where many of the equity providers are. And we wanted to put people in the right place so we're not causing them to travel up and down too much between the 2 offices. If you were working on financing an offshore wind project in Germany, you would probably conduct those negotiations in London using lawyers based in the city and write the documents in English. So for things like offshore wind, it made sense, and the waste business, to put them down in London, close to where the transactions and the other investors are. Energy efficiency is obviously a more distributed kind of business. There's projects all over the country. So there was no need to put that in London, so we put that up in Edinburgh. And then we took all of our support staff, all of the folks that are outlined that report up to Rob Comrie, and put them up in Edinburgh. So in the end, we have just over 35 people here in Edinburgh and about 50 down in London. So that's the split between the 2. I'm the chief executive of the whole business. Robert is the chairman of the whole business. He sits in Edinburgh. I spend most of my time in London. I spend 2 days a week in Edinburgh, 3 days a week in London on average.
Can I just progress this?
Well, seeing as you've stolen the ball away from pipeline, which we were talking about, I'll let you carry
I'll
on.
come back to pipeline. I promise you I'll come back to pipeline. But that's fine, thank you for that explanation. But what also confuses me is the private sector involvement. And looking at the ratios, I would have thought, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's being done by project or whether there's an anticipation that at some stage the investment bank, there will be equity issued to the private sector. I mean, what role does the private sector play in decision making, if any? I mean, clearly, if it's by project, it'll be on the project, but in terms of the actual overall strategy of the bank.
Our role is to catalyse private sector investments, and we work very closely with them. Of the 635 that we committed last year, we committed it with one part from the Green Investment Bank and 2.8 parts from everyone else, sort of a 1 to 3 ratio, so we provided just over 25% of the capital. And we do that project by project, as you sort of intimated in the question at the moment, where a project developer or a utility will bring us a project. They will say, this project needs equity. It's got all the debt organised, it needs a piece of equity, or it's got all of the equity organised and it's short £50 million, for example, in the debt syndicate. And we then fit in. We take the same price as the other investors, so we're not setting that price generally. We're filling in and fitting in with the terms that they provide. What we will think about going forward, but is instead of crowding in that money transaction by transaction, project by project, to go out and find institutional investors, people with long-dated capital that meet the long-dated nature of our assets. They're typically 20 years in operation, and say to them, we have a portfolio of opportunities. We have a £4 billion pipeline of opportunities that we see could close in the next 2 or 3 years. Would you like to give us some money up front that we could then sort of crowd that capital in first? Then we can go and work immediately with those projects because we have the private sector capital that sits beside us. We can't do more than 50% of any transaction, whether that's on the debt or the equity side. And we've been successful in sort of doing, 25% on average in the history. So working with them is clear, but we will look at ways of sort of crowding in the capital first rather than transaction by transaction, which is what we've done to date.
If I may just on that, clearly there's competition. I mean, capital isn't flowing as fast as we would like, but there's competition for cheap capital. I just wonder, we have under the auspices of Scottish Enterprise, the Scottish Investment Bank, which has a renewable energy investment fund, REIF, which promotes the use of energy from renewable sources. I mean, that's, if you like, a competition under the government auspices of two bodies. How do you relate to them?
We're actually complementary in all extents. They have a specific mandate, and I'm sure you're aware of where the capital came from, to look at local community projects of slightly smaller scale, and they've also spent more time on sort of earlier stage wet renewables, so marine and tidal. There is a little bit of overlap there because that sits in one of our sectors, but they have tended to look at much smaller deals at an earlier stage in the capital cycle. So they would, I would suggest, take slightly higher risk position than we do in our investments, where the need to make a commercial return is one of the key drivers alongside the green side. So we see them as a complementary source of capital, and quite often we will receive inbound calls and we will redirect them either to REIF, or they may go to SGIP, or they may go to the SFT, or whatever we think might be the most appropriate pool of capital. It's quite important that we work as a team, frankly, because we're not the panacea. We're one intervention, and REIF fulfil a very complementary part alongside us.
And just one question to come back to the pipeline.
Okay, well, before we do that, Marco, you want to come in on the governance issue?
Well, I don't want to disrupt the smooth running order. If we stick
afraid
with
that's
pipeline,
already gone
come back to it later.
way out the window.
Well, I will run with this ball for quite a few questions, convener. If
on
governance.
On governance. Well, I think given governance has been raised, I think we'll just deal with that and then go back to the pipeline. So come in.
Okay. Going back then, really, to what was trailed at the start about the split between Edinburgh and London governance. You said that there were 31 people employed, Lord Smith, in Edinburgh and 50 in London. Now, perhaps I'm a layman here, but that doesn't strike me as what the average person on the street would think of as headquartered in Edinburgh with a branch in London. Instead, it looks a little bit like the opposite. So I wonder if you could just tell me what the 50 in London are doing, because we had the job breakdown in Edinburgh: risk, finance, legal, sustainability, operations. What are the 50 in London doing?
Apart from the energy efficiency team, which is based up in Edinburgh, so that's a deal-doing team. The other deal-doing teams are based down in London. Incidentally, all board meetings, except for very occasional things where we can't get people together, take place in Edinburgh. And there are 4 Scottish directors out of 9 on the board down there in GIB. But when it comes to what are these guys doing down there, I'd like to know, actually.
Would you? Okay, I'll see if I can inform you any better then. So it really is focused on the transaction side. We have 2 or 3 parts to that. We have a strategy team who are working on where we should be investing, what's happening in the market, making sure we understand that. We have the capital markets folks. So we supported BIS in the IPO of a very important transaction which took listed project equity to the main market in London. So anything to do with the capital markets, again, because it's in London, is in London. And then each of the investment teams on offshore wind and on waste and biomass is in London. And each one of those has about 10 folks plus a couple of support folks in them. So that's basically it. It's capital markets, it's strategy, and it's each of the transaction teams. And those deals get done in London. As I said, if you were financing a German wind project and you had a Swedish investor, you would probably end up coming to London, doing the docs in London in English, and you know that's just the market. So we didn't want to. We're very conscious of our green footprint. We use video conference a lot between the 2 offices, but we just didn't want a whole pile of people sitting in Edinburgh, and the first thing they do on Monday is get the train or the flight down to London to spend the week living in a hotel, to fly back up or train back up on a Friday night.
I appreciate that is not a desirable situation, certainly not a very green situation.
Exactly.
But you refer to these deals being done in English with lawyers in the city. We do speak English in Scotland as well, and we do have quite a lot of lawyers in Edinburgh. It strikes me as a little bit London-centric there, and based on your description, I think an observer wouldn't be faulted for saying the meat and drink of what you're doing is happening in London, and you have a back office function in Edinburgh plus your board meetings here.
I take some issue with that. I think our energy efficiency team, and that's our experts, technical experts, as well as deal doers, financiers and so on, are absolutely based up here. Sometimes they have to go to Manchester or Birmingham, you know, on missionary expeditions and so on. But don't make any mistake, even the Royal Bank of Scotland, their core team in things like project finance or their green teams and so on are based in London. There are very few of them, actually, although it's headquartered up here in Edinburgh. So if you're meeting like-minded people, you have to be down there. And there's also history to GIB. It was housed initially, there were sort of front runners, if you like, way back about 18 months ago. And that team was gradually being built up to work out green policies and things like that. And they were based in London because no one knew where headquarters were going to be at that stage. So there's a little bit of a legacy there. But a lot of the very senior people are based up here. And I wouldn't just dismiss it as back office. You know, the whole legal headquarters and IT and so on, and HR and so on are based up here.
What's the difference in salary spend? Do you have those figures between how much is spent
London
in Edinburgh
and,
and how much in London?
Yeah, the average salary across the bank is about 110,000 per annum. It's in Edinburgh about 80,000 and about 120 in London. So London people cost more.
So if you do the maths, it's sort of 80 times 30 odd and 125 times.
Right, okay, thank you, Marco. Right, pipeline issues, then we'll go back to it. Hanzala, were you going to come in on this? Yes,
Lord Smith will be aware that Glasgow is really the centre of the universe, so I'll try to stick to Glasgow initially. I came across a company, a very new company called Greens Waste, and they're very keen to recycle and create energy from this company. And my heart of hearts says they are not aware of your operations and your facilities. And I'm wondering, the fact that they are a very small infant company, would you actually consider mentoring them and bring them on board so that they could benefit from something that what you do, and of course vice versa, you would benefit from their profit margins?
Can I just first of all, if you've got 3.8 billion and you have 80 people, you cannot go chasing deals of 500,000, 1 million, 2 million. We'd be here till, you know. So what we've done is we tend to invest about £30 million, and that tends to be our sort of minimum take in any one transaction on our main fund. However, we have delegated money. We've invested in 4 different funds, and these guys will go into the detail of that, who do different things. They might be quite into waste, or they might be quite into, you know, whatever, and they deal with it. So if your people want to speak to one of those funds, we'd be delighted to introduce them, because they do earlier stage, and they do much smaller than we would do. But we had to delegate that. Do you want to talk about the full funds?
Let me tell you about the rationale for it. As you said, it's about, we need to focus on the larger transactions, but we fully recognise that there is a group of younger, smaller companies throughout Scotland, throughout the rest of the UK, that don't need 30 or 40 million. They're not at that stage of development. What they need is 5 million for the first pilot scale plant or something. The economics would work, it would meet our green criteria. So we went out and we ran a competition to find 2 fund managers that we gave a very tight mandate to. So they came and they pitched us on their background, their knowledge of the market, the deal pipeline they had, the networks that they could find things, and their experience of making these types of transactions work. And we gave, on average, about 50 million to all 4 of them. One got 30 million, 2 to do waste to energy and biomass projects, and 2 to do energy efficiency. Typically, those are smaller projects. And they've been working, they've each made their first rounds of investments now. In fact, the project that we backed in Scotland was through one of those funds, because it was a relatively small investment, just over £1 million, and not one the bank probably could have done by itself, but it shows that that mandate is working. So where there are earlier stage or smaller typically, but bankable, you know, green and profitable projects, bring them to us, we'll direct them to the right folks, and then they can and see if that works for them. We're not in the job, I should say, of mentoring. It's just not possible for us to mentor all the companies. We act purely like a bank. So if you bring us a project, which is a good project, but not quite bankable yet, not quite ready for significant capital, we'll certainly lay out for you, it needs a power purchase agreement, it needs a supply agreement, those need to match the tenor of the loans, things like that. But we haven't the capacity with just over 80 people to, you know, send folks out, help them set up their business, help explain what it is. We'll tell them what's missing, and we'll ask them to bring it back when it's ready.
Chair, I got the feeling, and it may be misplaced, but I got the feeling that you're really looking for almost cherry picking, going to councils and the big organizations who are already established, and therefore deny the newcomers, Johnny come lately, are denied that opportunity, and a lot of them have some very fresh thinking, and then we miss out on that. That was one feel I got from your presentation this morning so far. And the other thing I'm still getting is that you're not really there for the small guy, and I think that's important. That I'm not sure what your split is in terms of investments. Are you going for the easy kills, you know, the councils and the local governments, and or are you actually going out to industry? And what's the split in that too?
Yeah, we are. Let me respond. So first of all, it's not just the well-established companies. One of the transactions that we announced this year, so post our financial results, was a CHP, combined heat and power biomass project in Northern Ireland, where this is the first project developed by two brothers. It's an 80 million project, so it's quite a large project, but it was their very first one. And so it is possible for folks with good projects to come forward. And of course, they had lots of support, they had lots of advice, they had backing from export credit agencies, they had the utility in Northern Ireland sign the power purchase agreement. I mean, it's not small scale, but it was a first time. On the smaller scale plants, I mean, we're here to back very large scale transition to a greener economy, and these large scale projects that we look at are typically for an offshore wind farm. It can be anywhere between 500 million and over £1 billion. Those are the types of transactions which are very short of large scale capital, and we're just not set up to go from providing £50,000 loans to £200 million loans. It's not possible to cover all of the things at the same time. But for people with new projects, for people with projects that need £2 or £3 or £4 million, we have thought about it. We have set up funds to deal with them. They are investing money. The investment we made in Scotland, that was £1 million investment, of which 585,000 came from GIB through the fund. That's a relatively small investment. What was interesting about that is we believe it's the first, and we'll be able to use it as a kind of cookie cutter. There are a large number of places that could take this biomass boiler, and having got the first one done, which is always the most difficult, we can replicate it again and again and again. Same providers, same technology, same financing.
Margaret, do you want to come in on the pipeline issue?
No, it was on investment. I wanted
Oh, well, I'll come back to you in a minute. Chick, you had a question on pipeline?
Just two very brief ones. One is given, as I've read recently, that down south at peak load, the government faces a margin of 4% safety, and therefore there's a lot of pressure, as we know, in the system. Can I ask, firstly, Lord Smith, are you facing any political interference in terms of projects and what those that might be done more quickly? That's the first question. The second question, Mr. Comrie, is you mentioned district heating systems. I wonder if you've had any conversations with Scottish coal interests, given the opportunities of using what is now the resource that's now lying in disused coal mines for providing district heating systems within communities in Scotland.
On the first one, I can tell you there's been no political interference, slightly to my surprise. I expected Vince Cable's, Vince Cable's constituency might be preferred route for some of this money, but I promise you there has been no political interference. You know, sometimes when we're putting deals together, you suspect that there might be, you know, something's behind, but we, honestly,
tremendous support from everyone.
And that includes north of the border here, just for the avoidance of doubt. Robin?
Yeah, just on the second one about Scottish coal, I'm not aware that we have, but I will ask when I get back just to double check and come back to you with an answer. But I'm not aware at this moment, but it's a good idea.
Okay. Pipeline. Marco.
With regard to the pipeline, you referred to the position you take with regard to affordability and a return. How does that square with the necessity to invest in projects that are inherently risky? And where is your additionality there over what a company in a pipeline might be able to get from a fully commercial investor? Because they're looking for profitability as well.
So let me have a go at trying to answer that, because people will often bring us projects and say, let me use offshore wind, something that we can all, you know, easily kind of get our heads around. They'll come and they'll say, we'd like you to invest in our offshore wind project. Now, we can afford so much equity. The banks have provided so much debt. We need you to fill up the difference, and we'll pay you this flat rate of return in your first loss. We're also a bit worried that the debt we've got short term, so can you underwrite that refinancing risk that might come in 3 or 4 years' time when we need to do that? And by the way, we're a bit worried about these CFDs or the ROC regime and how they're going to work. And so can you guarantee some sort of floor on the power price for us? Because if you could do that, we can mobilize all the capital we want. We'll get 10 of these things built. And we politely say no to most of those, right? The reason we do is we're trying to create a market that is self-financing over time. And we can't do that by just taking away all the inherent risks in these projects from the project developers, taking them onto our balance sheet, because we only have 3.8 billion, and as I outlined at the beginning, the size of the low carbon generation needs is 110 billion. If I did that, I would use all of that money. Invariably, a whole load of those risks would come home to roost. We'd burn through our 3.8, we'd have a whole load of losses, the Green Investment Bank would cease to exist, and the problem would still exist in the market. So we need to fix those problems with the market, find solutions. Who should own the power price risk? Who should own the construction risk? Who should own the refinancing risk? And find solutions to allocate those risks and therefore allocate the returns that come with them in a way that capital will flow. We can use our money judiciously, it'll go further, and we won't see losses. How do we square that with additionality? It's about the sheer scale of what needs to be done. So if there were 5 billion of investment needed and we'd only back green and profitable projects, there may be enough money in the banking market to fund the 5 billion and you wouldn't need us. But with 110 billion needed over the next 10 years, there just isn't enough banks and isn't enough capital. So we invest on the same terms. When we've refinanced things like in refinancing offshore wind, we sit in the banking syndicate. We get all of the same terms that the other banks do. But what we have in each case is if we're buying refinancing, we've got a commitment from the lead arranger of that capital that they've gone out, they've looked all around the market, they've tried to raise £250 million. They've got 185 of it raised, they've 200 of it raised, and they really need us to come in. We will then take the same terms that the rest of the banking syndicate are in. Of course, we do our own due diligence. Of course, we reflect on that return and make sure that we think it's adequate to cover the risks and it represents the market, so we're not in any way undermining the market, but we don't set the price. And that's why additionality really matters and counts.
This is quite a tricky one, because you say, how can you go for being profitable and be additional at the same time? Well, what you can get, because the banking market is not perfect again yet, one thing is the length of lending and the refinancing risk. One thing is you might have a syndicate of 5 banks ready to do something and one falls out, because they're quite jittery just now. And we actually come in and plug that gap. So that's commercial, because we can say these other commercial people would have done it at those rates. But without this, it would not happen. So we've done, and one of the transactions there is a classic example of that, as filling a gap in a syndicate. Right now we're speaking to a Japanese organisation. It's actually not a bank, it's a supplier of something offshore. Unless we were investing alongside them, they would be too nervous. Now, we're not saying, by the way, that we're guaranteeing that the ROC regime or the contracts for difference or whatever is going to be out. We can't do that. But because we're there, there's just a Japanese level of comfort that a sort of government-backed bank is kind of in there. That's the sort of thing. Let me give one last example, and I'd like you to explain this, the green coat deal, where we broke a mould. Something happened that would never have happened without us.
We want to bring in the right type of capital, and these projects are long-dated, 20-year capital, and they need long-dated finance on the debt and the equity side. That institutional capital is the capital that sits in all of our pension funds and all of our investments to look after us in our retirement. And when pensions allocate that, they put a lot of that capital into very safe things like government bonds. They put maybe 50 or 60%. 30% they put into equities, to the stock market effectively. Then they take 10% and they put it into a variety of things they call alternatives. A small portion of that goes into infrastructure. A small portion of that goes into renewable energy of infrastructure. So if you're always battling for something that's a couple of percent of the whole pie, it's very difficult. What we wanted to do was target that 30-ish% that they hold in equities. But if you want to invest today, typically in renewable energy infrastructure, you have to go through a private fund mechanism. So we wanted to bring a vehicle to the main market in London that would target that bigger pool of capital, that 30% that are in listed equities. A team had been out before, 2 years ago. They assembled a group of assets. They tried to list. They tried to raise £200 million on the AIM market and were unable to get to the total. We restructured that. We brought it onshore. We took it to the main market. We committed £50 million. It's managed by us, but it's held by BIS. And they succeeded in acquiring the assets and listing. And when they went to list, this time they had to raise between 205 and 260 million pounds, and it was significantly oversubscribed. It was the biggest IPO in the renewable energy business in the first half of the year globally. Since we concluded that, there have been 4 or 5 additional companies have come to market with very similar offers, many of which have succeeded in listing. So by demonstrating that it can be done and getting the first one away, we didn't think it was risky capital. That's why we were willing to do it. But it was risky in the sense of putting our reputation at stake. It was risky in the sense of being novel and innovative. But as a result, now there are 4 or 5 funds. There are hundreds of millions of pounds from that 30% pool of capital now coming into this market that were previously precluded because there was no vehicle in which to invest. That's the type of stuff that we're trying to focus on: innovative, green, and profitable.
So where does that leave the technologies that were described as wet renewables before, the fledgling technologies, wind, offshore wave and tidal, offshore wave and tidal in particular? Are they left to go to other sources like reef, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think while wet renewables sits within our remit, we always go back to the green and profitable. There's no doubt the green part, I think you could argue that it would meet that case. On the economics, I mean, having worked with some of these companies in the past, I think they are going down the traditional route of seed capital, the friends and family route, the initial invention, but they are now sitting in the hands of the people best able to nurture them, which are Siemens, Alstom, ABB, the very large engineering companies, who I think will now take them from fledgling businesses with a great idea and a potential market to one with a commercial rigor and the technology, a proven technology. And I think at the moment we see it more as a watching brief. We'd like to engage, which is not a problem. We want to be part of that debate. But I think we see that sector as a watching brief for others to invest in. As and when we can invest alongside other commercial institutions, we'll no doubt be looking at it. But I think that's something for the future.
It's incredibly important in our early transactions that we demonstrate the green and the profitable, hugely. As we think about the comments that Robert made at the beginning around creating an enduring institution, for a bank, that means the ability to raise capital. We will only be able to raise capital if our projects are profitable, and so far all of our projects look good. They're very much at the less risky end of that spectrum, from venture capital through private equity to sort of infrastructure, definitely more in the infrastructure and senior debt side. But with building a track record over time, the bank will be able to access more and more types of private capital. But if we were to take on those early venture capital projects, which are inherently risky and much more likely of losing money, you may have some winners and some losers, is typically what a venture portfolio looks like. I think the losers that we would have as a result of that are disproportionately difficult for us in these first few fledgling years of the bank. And as we go out to raise that capital, to build an enduring institution, we need to do it on the back of profitability, and people will be looking very carefully at those first few years of operations and the investments we've made. So we're definitely on the infrastructure. We'll do debt or equity or guarantees, much less risky, and we need others to step up and do the venture capital piece that moves them down through the cost curve, up through the reliability channels. And when these represent an infrastructure-like investment, we'll be right there ready to do it.
And is that venture capital role something you could potentially envisage moving into yourselves later on as you have become established, as you have built your capital?
Some of us come from a venture capital background. We'd love to be in there. But right now, you know, if we start spraying small amounts of money and half of them go bust and so on, we'll be closed down.
And lastly, I'm playing the Mike McKenzie role. Do you think there could be more confidence in the sector, and in particular from commercial investors, if there was at UK level a headline, for example, a decarbonisation target as we have in Scotland for energy supply?
Let me have a go at that one. We're in the middle of a process called the Energy Market Review, as I'm sure you very well know, led by Department of Energy and Climate Change down in Westminster. It's a hugely important piece of legislation, probably the biggest piece of change that we've seen in the energy market since the breakup of the Central Electricity Supply Board. What it's trying to do is to provide more comfort to investors. They're more likely to be investors who have more of a financial background, infrastructure investors, the type of folks we're trying to crowd in as we do the deals. And it's designed to take away a lot of the risk. Today, if you invest in a renewable energy project, you get 1 rock or 2 rocks or 0.9 rocks, and the rest of your price floats with the power price. You're investing today in a 20-year asset, and you don't know what the power price is going to be in 4 or 5 or 10 years. And so there's significant amounts of risk, and it's causing the cost of capital to go up and the availability of capital to go down, and therefore we really have a bridge to this 110 billion number. As that gets rolled out and you get a contract for differences, effectively a fixed price for 15 years. So for the first time, and it'll be great for the UK, people will be able to say, if I'm sinking my capital into an offshore wind farm or into a waste-to-energy plant, I know what I'm going to get per each megawatt hour of power I produce for the next 15 years. I can go out and get very safe, long-dated capital, which is a lower cost that will bring the total amount of cost down. We need to see that. Anything that helps signal that and that commitment to the long term, which is your question, is very helpful to us, of course. Because as people start to come to the UK, commit to look at the projects, commit to work with us and the other commercial banks, and commit to really have a significant presence. Many of them are foreign direct investors or foreign engineering companies. You know, any signals that we can have are definitely helpful. The process always, when you change something this significant, has the unintended consequence of slowing everything down as everybody sits to see, should I do this project under the existing regime or should I do it under the new regime? What capital structures would work? And so we are seeing a hiatus at the moment of investment levels, as you would reasonably expect. The sooner Department of Energy and Climate Change, and we're supporting them and helping them on this, can work through the details of this and get it out, which they promised to do before the end of the year, the sooner we can start making progress again on investment levels.
Right. Mark McDonald had a question on risk. I've got 4 members who still need to come in. I'm conscious of the time. We've been running for 50 minutes, so we'll need to sharpen up a bit, please, on questions and answers. Mark.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll start off on the one on risk, and it's around the balance of risk, which I'm not sure I've seen coming forward yet. Obviously, post the banking crash, there was a move to extreme risk aversion in the lending sector, where previously there had been a sort of gung-ho attitude in many respects. Where do you sit between those two extremes, essentially? Because if all you're doing is offering the same kind of risk-averse approach that the banking sector offers currently, what are you bringing to the table for these projects that they can't get already in the financial markets?
So as I sort of alluded to in answering some of the other questions, if you think about investing in renewable energy from venture capital, maybe through private equity investment, development investments into building infrastructure, we're definitely at the end of that, i.e. the less risky end. We're not doing venture capital, we're not taking development risk. The reason that that's additional, the reason that that's additive is many of the investors coming in, first of all, there's the big gap that I pointed out, the 110 billion of low generating assets, low carbon assets that we need to build, and there's just not enough capital to do that today. So what we're adding is additional. Many of those new potential sources of capital are foreign direct investors, financial investors, and they take, frankly, a lot of comfort in being able to invest alongside a company, a bank which is owned by the government. They feel comfortable about the regulatory regime and the fact that if they're in the same piece of the capital structure with the same returns and the same risks, they feel more comfortable about that. So that's what we bring.
Obviously, one person's risk is another person's opportunity as well, so that there's that balance. In terms of profitability, obviously that plays a major role in your decision making. Do you have a specific point at which you would expect the investment to start turning a profit? Obviously, many of these projects are not going to be instantly profitable. So do you specify a specific time by which you must turn a profit, otherwise investment is not going to be forthcoming?
Because it's infrastructure, we're doing one of two things. We're either investing in an operating plant in return for the utility, usually, who owns it, to reinvest the money in building the new plant, or we're investing in construction. So everything's lined up. It's not like making a private equity investment in a company which needs to grow market share and build things. Whenever we make our investment, if it's a waste-to-energy plant, for example, it needs to have a 20-year waste supply contract if it's a large one. If it's a smaller one, maybe 10 years. It needs to have a power purchase agreement. It needs to have a fixed price contract to build the plant. It needs to have a fixed price operating contract from a known and reputable operator. So we lock all of these things in order to be at that lower risk end of the spectrum. We take away all of those risks through a lot of contractual negotiations. So the projects are either immediately profitable because we're buying into operating when they recycle, or will become so upon their construction, the completion of construction and commercial operation startup. So far, all of the projects are in line, and we've had no problems with any of our investments.
Just to be clear, because some projects will not be able to get some of the things you're talking about in place without having the finance behind them. So are you not entering into a kind of chicken and egg scenario there where you're asking for them to have long-term contracts in place, but they can't secure long-term contracts without the security of finance behind them?
It's an iterative process, so we sit down and we give them an expression of interest letter when we've done a little bit of work. They take that off and they try and get the contracts, they bring them back, we turn that into a memorandum of understanding, they take that back. And that's why, frankly, it takes 3 to 4 years from the idea of I'd like to build a biomass CHP plant beside this harbour to being lined up. They all got to come together at the end, and the finance is only one part of a very complicated thing, so that's why it takes so long.
One final brief question. In terms of your balance between investment in new infrastructure and new projects versus existing or long-standing projects, is that something you're also looking at in terms of allowing perhaps existing district heating to expand, for example?
We'd love to find both new and more and ways to extend the district heating systems which are there. Energy efficiency is the area which is great, right? It needs very little government support. It stands on its own 2 feet. It's incredibly green. And if we could find more opportunities, so I'd sort of ask everybody if you're aware of opportunities like that to extend district heating or put in new district heating, please bring them forward to the bank. Those are exactly the type of projects we'd love to back, but struggle finding ones of sufficient size and quality.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I have the impression from listening to evidence this morning that perhaps you might be more aptly entitled the big green projects investment bank. And please do correct me if that's wrong. It's Community Energy Fortnight at the moment, and I'm interested to learn a bit more about what you see your role, how you see your role, if you feel you have a role in investing in community renewables. And it seems quite, Mr. Comrie mentioned that you could perhaps handle 1,000 little projects if they were rolled into a bigger project, and Lord Smith suggested that you were concerned about spraying small amounts of money around and the risks inherent in that. I'm just wondering, do you see, are smaller projects always more risky? Would it be possible to amalgamate lots of smaller projects together? I'm just a bit concerned that smaller projects will look at you and think, this isn't the place for us. The Green Investment Bank, which is based in Edinburgh, perhaps couldn't help the local authority if it wanted to set up its own energy company. So I'd appreciate your views on those questions.
Small-scale renewables, community wind, solar, community energy efficiency projects are, I'm afraid, one of those things that the folks in Brussels have said that they think there is plenty of capital for, and are not allowing us. So, the areas that we can invest in, and 80% of our capital are offshore wind, waste to energy, waste recycling, and non-domestic energy efficiency. So those are bigger, like waste heat recovery projects. We can put 20% into carbon capture and storage, or wave and tidal, or bioenergy. But specifically with regards to small projects, unless they're purely energy efficiency projects, we're just not allowed to participate, the view being that there is enough capital. Now, if we can find someone who has the ability to roll those up, so it's not actually a bunch of small projects, but it really is an amalgamation, and there's a way to take that, put it all together, and refinance those, that's exactly the type of thing we'd love to do. We'd love to do more in this. But in smaller projects, typically have less well-established developers, have less corporate governance, are harder to manage. And, we are the big green investment bank, to go back to your question. The focus is to really make a dent in that 110 billion. And we need to do that 50 million and 100 million at a time. If someone can put together 50 or 100 million of the smaller projects, we'd love to do that.
Can I just ask on the issue of borrowing? The UK government has stated that you would only have borrowing powers from 2015 when the target for debt has fallen as a percentage of GDP. But the Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that the peak of public sector borrowing, public sector net debt as a percentage of GDP is likely to be beyond that 2016 to 17. So, you know, you're waiting at the moment, and I just wonder what it is that you feel you bring to the table that is over and above what other, you know, funding streams are providing. Yes. And, you know, apart from skills in investing money and so on, can someone come to the Green Investment Bank and get additional information that will make them think, yes, this is the place for me to go?
So let me deal with the borrowing piece and then come back to the information and advice, if you like. When the spending review was announced and there was another 800 million of allocation, what came with that is an ability for the bank to borrow in 2015, 2016 from the government. That will give us additional borrowing powers. But I guess what I'm focused on in our first few months, I mean, we've had a great start in terms of, you know, moving forward 2.5 billion now of projects by committing now it's over 700 million of our own money to those. And if we're successful in building a successful institution that's both green and profitable, there will be a variety of sources of capital available to us. Private sector capital, I mentioned it when I was answering one of the earlier questions. So I'm really focused. With 3.8 billion, we have more than enough capital for the next couple of years. So let's build a successful institution. Let's build something that can access different types of capital based on its profitability. So it's not a barrier for us at the moment. With regards to advice, look, we do provide specific advice on what it takes to make a project bankable. We see lots and lots of projects. Of the 4 billion in our pipeline, we've seen probably twice that number of projects. The 4 billion are ones that we think are on a path to success that we can actually back over the next couple of years. For all of them, and for some of the ones that didn't make that cut, when they come and they tell us about their plan, we make it very clear, just like I've sort of answered the previous question that says you'll need a power purchase agreement, you'll need a waste supply contract, you'll need a fixed price contract to build the plant. Here are the 4 or 5 guys who typically do this. You'll need to put together someone who can do the operations, and we'll describe to them, and sometimes we give them a letter if they ask for it in writing, what it would take to actually turn what's a really good idea into a bankable project. So that type of advice we do. We don't have an advisory part in the bank who, you know, makes money from advising people, but we tell people what it will take to take their project, their early stage great idea, to something that will then stack up and will be investable.
Okay. Margaret McDougall.
I feel I've been waiting a long time to ask this question, and you have touched on around the answer that I'll be looking for in some of your previous answers. But obviously these projects all depend on capital investment, or certainly most of them do. And when we look at investment, we're talking about banks. And I mean, Lord Smith, you mentioned earlier that banks are a bit jittery just now. Is that because of the uncertainty around the markets in general, or is it more to do with the renewables and the changes to subsidy for renewables?
There's 2 answers really. One, there is uncertainty about the change from ROC to contracts for difference. But by the way, the government's got to be very careful here. They've got to be generous enough about these things and certain enough about these things to encourage the market. But you've seen the debate about nuclear and so on. If you go too far down that line, the British consumer could be paying for a very long time for a very expensive form of electricity. But what the other part to your question, I'm sorry.
No, just around, you know, the general, the
banks, I'll tell you what the problem is. It's really at the longer end. If banks under Basel III or BAL 3, depending on how, if you lend, they're trying to get banks to be borrow short, lend short, borrow medium, lend medium, borrow long, lend long, borrow equity and take equity risk. So if you lend over a period of 10, 15 years, you have to have such a capital buffer in there that the banks say, crikey, this is becoming less economic. So on the one hand, we're trying to make sure banks don't get into the position they got before by having very large capital bases. But the longer they lend, the more capital they've got to keep. And it's really quite steep, that curve. So that actually deters banks from doing that. Now, do we want them lending 20-year money and borrowing in the market overnight? No, we don't. But that's what's actually slowing things down just now.
Yeah, let me give you an example. A number of waste PFI, PPP projects we've started to become involved in. These projects take 4 or 5 years to secure the waste supply contract, find the location to build the site, get planning permission, get the all of this stuff. And they typically, when they make the bid, go in with a banking consortium who are willing to finance it. You get 25 years, typically waste supply contracts. The plant's designed to operate and be around for 25 years, and you need 15 to 20-year debt to support the equity to get the returns to make the pitch. What we find is banks have then started having won the processes. Some of the waste companies are finding that their finance providers have come back to them and said, we're very sorry, this went through credit committee 2 years ago. We were able at that point to provide 15-year capital, but we're only able to provide 7-year capital now. That's the maximum the bank can do. And so I'm afraid we're going to have to step away from this. And these are projects ready to go. So we've stepped in and taken their position, providing the 15-year capital. Some Japanese banks, some banks in mainland Europe still feel that they can provide that. But a lot of the banks in the UK are now switching from 12 to 15-year debt to 7-year debt. And that long-dated debt is what's needed for these long-dated projects. So there's a challenge.
That you're a government-funded bank, do you have any influence in the banking industry to help with that situation? And my other question is on the renewable situation, the change from rocks, when are we likely to have that answer and settled?
The Department of Energy and Climate Change say they will have answers on that by Christmas. They've already got proposals out and they're seeking consultation and so on, but they reckon that they will nail that down by Christmas this year. So that's one thing. How do you...
Then will they then feel more comfortable about lending?
They'll feel more comfortable in that part of the equation. They still have this, the strictures coming out of Switzerland, from Basel, saying that they have to keep very large capital sums there. And, a lot of them are still working their way back into profitability. So there's sort of uncertainty around that. They don't want to go back to this reckless thing again. Mm-hmm. And, 2 areas, therefore, the supply of money to small and medium-sized enterprises is tricky as well. Because again, that's money, as we've mentioned earlier, that could go out and you could lose some of it. We've all been in the venture capital industry in the past, and we know that you get a big winner and some losers and so on. But I think it'll.
Yeah, going the other part of your question about can we influence the banking market? I don't think. I
avoided that one.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think we can influence the larger banking market. I think that's very difficult for an institution like ours. But what we can do is influence people around specific projects that they'll feel more comfortable when they're investing alongside not just any institution, but a UK-owned institution that's got government money sitting beside them. That gives particularly foreign banks who are outside of the UK comfort around our regulatory regime and the fact that they're sitting in the same place in the capital structure as the government-owned bank. So I think we can be influential there, and we've seen that in a number of investments we've made.
Okay, thank you.
Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. I've been listening to all this with great interest, and it strikes me though that fundamentally, I mean, you talked about a 200 billion investment required over the next 10 years or so. Some commentators are suggesting much more than that. Given your initial capitalisation and the parameters in which you have to work, don't you think that really you're just not big enough to make the required difference?
Well, in the words of Kermit the Frog, it's not easy being green. So we've got a big job to do. We really do. We can only be successful around crowding in the rest of that money if we turn a profit on the initial 3.8 billion of capital we have. Now, My role is to make sure we're a successful organisation. If we are a successful organisation and we can show that investing in debt or equity in these projects is profitable, other people will come join us, and that's where the money will come from.
I'm just not, you know, I can see that you need to grow as a bank quite significantly in order to make the required difference. But I don't see how you square that with the very tight operating parameters, which, you know, force you. Obviously, you need early success. In order to do that, you're perhaps risk averse. But I don't see how you square the particular circle, you know, or two graphs, two lines on that graph between aversion to risk and the growth that you require as a bank to make the difference that we actually need to make, you know, in order to get where we need to be in terms of that minimum of 200 billion investment.
It doesn't feel we're short of capital right now, I can tell you, because the deals aren't around. I mean, you just heard you know, because of the uncertainty and pricing and all the rest of it, that a lot of the deals are just not happening. So we've got plenty of capital right now to see us through. But I think things will evolve. I think if we develop this bank, Chairman, can I indulge me just a wee bit of history? In the 1960s, I was very privileged to join an organisation called ICFC, Industrial Commercial Finance Corporation. It was just after the war. British industry needed to be rekindled, and the banks, again, were, you know, flat out. They couldn't really provide long-term capital and equity capital. And ICFC was set up. The government twisted a lot of arms. Bank of England put in money and so on. It was quasi-government, but it had a social purpose. And it was there to help small and medium-sized companies with long-term capital and equity capital and so on. And we made thousands of investments. It was so successful, we got imitators coming out of the woodwork. NatWest decided to set up an equity thing. Barclays decided to set up an equity thing and long-term loans for small and medium-sized companies. And before you knew it, there was a whole market had developed, and we actually developed huge skills, and the people left ICFC and went out and founded venture capital organisations of their own. If we can achieve something like that, and eventually, no doubt, we'll end up with equity partners who are not government in there, with government still being sure that we stick to our green credentials. If we could create that kind of market, and it does take a few years, you can't do it in 6 months or a year, then I think we'll have succeeded mightily. And funnily enough, with ICFC, they didn't work themselves out of jobs. It remained a very large organisation, but it spawned all sorts of imitators and a whole market. And that's the dream as far as I'm concerned.
Do you not feel, well, that, I mean, the whole industry, you talked about the investment hiatus, and I think that's absolutely correct. But do you not feel that if the UK government when they do set the contract for different strike prices, if they get that right, there'll almost be no need for a green investment bank. And if they get it wrong, you don't have sufficient resources to make the difference.
I'm a wee home now.
Actually, I want to, but if I don't ask you, you know, these kind of questions, then we're not going to.
It'll be something, if government gets this about right, it's not going to get it perfect. If it gets about, I think it will unlock. There's an awful lot of schemes out there where people, I know this with other hats on, where people, you know, Beatrice and fields like that, and Galloper down just off the Thames and so on, where they could be accelerated quite quickly if there was some sort of certainty over the next 15, 20 years and so on. So everyone's waiting on all this happening, and I think there could be a surge. Now, if there is a surge, people still need capital. Then we'll be saying, hey, we might run out of our 3.8 billion, maybe we've got to go for more. If government doesn't provide it, someone else will provide it. If we're being successful, I'm telling you, you attract capital, both debt and equity capital. If they get it totally wrong, I think you will find that some things will not be built. If they get it wrong the other way and it's too attractive, the British taxpayer and the British consumer is going to pay very dearly for it. It's a very, very difficult line to row.
Don't you feel, though, that in terms of, you know, and I'm just exploring possibilities,
but we, Mike, just conscious of the time, can we, you know, just come to a question?
Yep. In terms of how you spend the money, surely that you know, you would get more bang for your buck actually investing in the risky areas, the new technologies that nobody else is prepared to touch. And then the part B to that question is that there seems, I mean, I'm wondering if you're interested in investing in interconnectors, because it seems to me that that's low risk, but there's a problem in, for instance, our island groups, which we know have got huge energy generating potential, but Ofgem rules mean that the cost, a disproportionate cost of the interconnectors has to be borne by the first bigger project that can do it, and that because of that it's kind of locked that out because no single project has emerged that's big enough. Seems to me there's a low risk opportunity to achieve a very big bang for your buck.
When we look at how we balance these things, indeed we have a 2x2 matrix that looks at risk and green impact. So we are trying to do the things which have the lowest risk and the biggest green impact. And the problem with some of the venture capital, early technology stuff is they don't fit. They have the potential for a big green impact, but they're hugely risky. And if we went out and we made 10 investments in early stage technologies, things that may provide great opportunity in 7 or 8 or 9 years, and half of those failed, we'd be sitting in front of you today explaining how we've lost money, yet unable to demonstrate to you that the things which, you know, we're still going, we're going to deliver that, because they would be very early stage still. And what we would demonstrate to the market is this renewable energy stuff, it's all quite difficult and very risky, and maybe we shouldn't put any money in it. What we're trying to demonstrate to the market is there is an opportunity here in the infrastructure side, given the scale of it and needed in the UK, to make good returns given the risk, good returns at low risk. And if we can demonstrate we can do that, then much more capital will flow in, which will sort of get to your earlier point about, you know, you don't have enough. Some of that capital will flow in directly on the back of good results from us. Some of that capital may flow into us and people say, you guys are doing a great job. Can we put some money alongside your money? And then we'll have much more capital. And so you get a virtuous circle. Well, the other thing, you could be out of work in 3 months.
Incidentally, we have got lots and lots of foreign investors like sovereign wealth funds and so on talking to us all the time. Can we get in this action? So there's no shortage of capital outside there.
One word answer on interconnectors, great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I hope that's something that you look at very carefully, but it just seems to me that you want what everybody else wants, you know, low risk, steady, moderate success. In new technology, though, and some of the exciting possibilities, and, you know, everybody's standing back hoping the other guy will do the pioneering work, and it seems to me that to really make a difference, somebody has to go first there. Perhaps it's not you, maybe it's going to be somebody else.
40 years in the venture capital industry, so I'm desperate to do this.
Okay, the 2 members want to ask what I hope were very brief supplementaries. Marco Biaggi.
If you do turn a profit on this capital, would you expect to be privatised?
So I guess over time our job is to crowd in and catalyse private sector investment. That's people who will co-invest with us. It may be project by project. It may be that they ask us to manage their money to find these things. And it may be that they put equity money into the bank. All of those things, I guess, are on the table and are up to our shareholder to decide when's the right time, who the right investors would be. But if we're successful, I think, you know, government has a view that maybe they're not always the best investor in a commercial enterprise, and we are a for-profits bank.
And they would actually free us from a lot of Brussels restrictions. There's things we absolutely could do, including some of the venture stuff, but into other areas as well that we currently we can do.
Yeah, thank you very much. Coming full circle back to the pipeline projects. Basically, how many, and obviously I acknowledge the fact that you mentioned the confidentiality aspect, but how many are based in Scotland, and what's the projected forecast of investment?
I think it's very hard to give you just a number of projects that are on a pipeline. I think if you look at the Scottish Green Investment Portfolios list, it's a couple of thousand. It's that number of projects ranging from those which are tiny to those which are very large, like the big offshore projects in the Moray Firth and elsewhere. All we can say is the investment banking teams across all the sectors have got some very significant projects which we are working on as we speak. We can't talk about for confidentiality reasons, but I'm absolutely certain something.
Your investment bank, basically, I'm just trying to ascertain how many are potentially there based in Scotland and what your forecast investment might be.
To be honest, I don't think I can give you a number because I don't think that's not the basis on which we operate. What we have is trying to create opportunities, of which there are numerous, and then put them through the process of whether they are green and profitable, and that's it.
Can I give you, if I may be so bold, a challenge? Street lighting here in Scotland is a tremendous opportunity. Payback periods are 7 or 8 years. Technology is proven. Each of you has some influence with your local authorities. Please help them bring forward projects that we can finance.
Just to follow up Dennis's question, I appreciate you can't give these the projects. Have you got a rough idea what sort of percentage of the, the 4 billion you're talking about might be Scottish?
Why don't we come back in writing rather than guess at the number? Okay. Very happy to do that. We'll give you a range of how many projects, size, and we'll come back in writing just when we've time to analyse it.
Okay, thank you. Hanzala, yeah.
Up until recently, we actually manufactured the wind farm equipment in Scotland. That's no longer being manufactured in Scotland now. The fact that we're looking for wind farms all around the country and elsewhere, would you encourage that to be re-established in Scotland if you had a proposal?
Yes, I mean, the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills recently published an offshore wind strategy document that we are very much fed into and participate in a number of the workshops that they've held to talk about how we can take the percentage of a wind farm that's constructed anywhere in the UK and make much more of it homegrown. So we support that. We'd love to see the supply chain emerge. The key to the supply chain emerging is seeing a long-dated list of investable projects. So the first part of that is let's see when we get the CFDs right, the contracts for differences, get the strike price right so that these are profitable. With that, we'll see the pipeline going to fruition. And when you can see a 5-year or a 10-year track where you can do multiple offshore wind farms, then the supply chain will start to be invested here in the UK because it makes sense to do it. It could be cheaper than bringing it from mainland Europe. But that's what we need to see, a long-dated pipeline of these things to get that established. But yes, of course, we're very supportive.
I think that's the nightmare scenario, that we've got the wind to wave the tide, right? That this should be some form of gold like the North Sea. And if foreign companies come in with foreign workers, they bring in the kit, the blades and whatever else, they erect them, and then they carry on the operational, the maintenance and all the rest of it, and sell us back the electricity. Just, our wind and wave. Yes. And by the way, I didn't respond to Glasgow being the centre of the universe because some of these guys don't come from Glasgow.
No, but they need to know.
Right, okay, I think we need to call it a day at that. Thank you very much, Lord Smith, Mr Kingsbury, Mr Comrie for coming along. It's been a very helpful session. It's run a little bit longer than we anticipated, but I think that just reflects the number of issues and the interest committee members have in the subject. And what I think we'd like to do is continue a dialogue with you and maybe, get you back before the committee maybe in a year's time just to get a progress report.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And we'll have a short suspension before our next business.
Thank you.
Right, if we can reconvene and remind members we're still in public session at this stage. Item 4 on the agenda, we have a response from Fergus Ewing at the Scottish Government to the committee report on Bannockburn 2014. And as members will be aware, Visit Scotland and the National Trust have already undertaken to come back to us in January for a further evidence session and an opportunity to update the committee on how things are progressing, not just in relation to Bannockburn, but in relation to the Year of Homecoming 2014. And I think that will be quite a useful opportunity to question them on issues like ticket sales and how event planning is going. Apart from that, do members have any comments they want to make on the Minister's response? And do we want to take any further action, or are we happy just to await the next evidence session?
Evidence session for me.
Yeah. Just happy to note, and we'll look forward to the next evidence session in January. Sorry, Hanzala?
Responding to us.
I don't think we routinely thank ministers for letters.
Since it's my first
We always express our gratitude
I'm quite happy
in
to
fulsome terms when he comes to the committee. So,
I'm quite happy to thank him.
I'm sure we will pass that on.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, item 5 on the agenda. The Scottish Government have provided the committee with a response to our recent report on RPP2. And we have that before us together with some supplementary evidence that's been received from Professor Shaun Smith of Edinburgh and Napier University, and also Stop Climate Chaos Scotland and WWF Scotland. There's a number of options here as to what we now do. We can go back to the Scottish Government on a number of issues, but before I get into that, do any members have any comments they want to make on the Scottish Government's response, or any issues they want to raise? Alison?
Have a look at the evidence that the response that Professor Shaun Smith has put forward, then I'm happy to wait till we get to that.
Well, I think we are there now.
Okay. Well, he's suggesting, for example, that the chair of the EET, yourself, should request that he points out that some of the, in his third paragraph, I wish to see abatement measures met and achieved, and my research institute works closely to deliver new methods and measure effectiveness. However, these RPP2 values are without foundation, and the chair of the EET should request that they are removed, otherwise the RPP2 becomes a document of smoke and mirrors. I wonder if that's something that you would consider doing.
I am entirely in the hands of the committee on that matter. The issue Professor Smith raises is an issue he raised when he came to give us evidence, and we had quite an extended discussion about that at the time. This is the question of these, additional technical matters which are contained in the figures for abatement within domestic dwellings. His evidence was very strong, and he said, this is just basically a made-up figure. It's a balancing figure in accountancy terms that's been put in, and we don't know where that's going to come from. And I think we had quite an extensive discussion about that, at the time. I'm entirely in the hands of members. If they want me to pursue this further, we can do that. Any other views, Mike?
I take the point that Professor Smith was making and Alison's making, but I think in a sense that when you've got quite fast-moving technologies and better understanding of what we can do, for instance, to improve domestic energy efficiency, I think you have to a certain extent, you can't look into your crystal ball and know exactly what the solutions are, but you can set a target that's both challenging but achievable. And I think really that explains those figures. And there's a sort of trade-off between setting a target and after all, the Minister will really catch it from, not least from yourself, I suspect, if targets aren't met. So there's, a degree of well, it's a toss-up between setting something that's challenging, and if it's going to be challenging, then by its nature it's not going to be easy, nor can you necessarily know exactly how it is that you're going to do it. And I think that's what Shaun Smith is on about, that with current technology, it's very difficult to see exactly how that figure arises. So I don't think it's anything to worry about, really.
I have a slight concern in that, and Shaun Smith's evidence was worthy, and as Mike said, the comments associated with it. But this, his supplementary evidence seems to suggest to me that, well, these measures are rubbish. And by the way, I'm coming up with a new method of working, and I've applied for funding, and that really doesn't help his cause.
Or maybe it does.
Well, in my view, my personal view, it doesn't help his cause. If there had been some evidence to say, historical evidence to say these were targets that were set, and on the basis of information that we currently have, they're rubbish, and indicate that rather than say, they're rubbish, and by the way, I have new methods, and I'm also looking for, a grant from the Funding Council to set up a team of experts. I wish him the best of luck, but he really hasn't helped his cause.
Okay, that's something of an ad hominem attack on Professor Smith, but you're quite entitled to your view.
As usual, I did say at the beginning that his evidence was worthy, but...
Okay, any other views? Marco?
The technical annex to the initial draft version did include mention of a modelling exercise that had been done in-house in the Scottish Government. I believe it was referred to in verbal evidence as well. What we may have here is simply a difference of opinion between experts, which always happens. I mean, the collective noun for academics is a disagreement. So on that basis, we've come to some position. This is definitely an area we need to look at. It's definitely an area that has presented itself as an issue to keep under watch, and certainly it's something that, in terms of the scale of emissions reductions that are accredited to it in the late stage, is very significant. But that is in the late stage, and I don't see a need to, well, use some of the language that's in the submission to describe RPP2 at this stage.
Okay. I mean, it would be open. There are a number of routes we could take. We could do nothing. We could ask the Scottish Government for a response to Professor Smith's fresh evidence, if we wished.
Why don't we write to them and ask them for a response?
Members content to do that? We'll write to the Scottish Government and say, Professor Smith has given us this evidence. We'd like to know what your opinion on it is.
Can we also ask that we get some, not just their response as to how they react to it, but that it's supported by any information from our technical, the government's technical people in terms of how the measures are produced.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can do that. Okay, people content with that as an approach? Okay, anything else anybody wants to raise about the government's response to RPP2 or the other evidence we've received?
I welcome the fact that all the things that we asked for in terms of better information, better clarity was included in the final draft. It's very easy as a committee to complain when things we ask for aren't done, but when they are, a due thanks is appropriate. Not that I'm suggesting we write and thank, but I'll put that on the record.
Well, I'd maybe just like to say that I actually find it quite heartening that Professor Smith has felt able to state his views quite clearly and then say that he would like funding for another project. I think it would be less than honest to hold his views back and then come at us and say, I'd like funding for another project. I think that's honesty that is admirable, personally.
I take your point, but I think it would be more helpful if he said, I wish to see the abatement measures met, and here's where we will, here's why I think our measurements will be better, rather than say these are not good, and by the way, I'm now looking for funding.
I don't think he's saying they're not
I'm
good.
not, I'm not just
Oh,
decrying
no,
the
no,
fact-
no, can we speak through the chair, please?
Sorry, beg your
Apologies.
pardon.
Right, Alison.
Yes, I don't think he's saying they're not good. I think he's simply saying, what are they? And, you know, frankly, I'm not someone who wants to rely on a crystal ball as to how we'll meet our climate change targets. I think he is saying they are missed. That there's no, you know, there is no suggestion as to what these abatement measures are.
Through you, Convener, I accept that, but what he does say, they're without foundation. Now, I would personally would have liked to have seen, you know, why are they without foundation, instead of, you know, if you, and good luck to him. I hope he gets the funding that will allow him to do whatever he wants to do. But I think it would be fairer to say, you know, they're without foundation, and here are the reasons why.
Well, to be fair, I think when he gave his evidence originally, he was quite clear as to why he felt they were out without foundation, because it was a very nebulous concept, this idea of additional technical developments that would allow the gap to be met. Anyway, look, I think we've agreed a course of action. So rather than pursue this debate, I think we've agreed what we're going to do. Now, a number of other issues which are in the paper you'll have in front of you. Are we happy to request the Scottish Government keeps us informed of progress in delivering RPP2? Do we wish to request an update on the conclusions of the Sullivan panel, which is to do with home insulation?
Yes,
yep.
And I think that might, you know, inform our, you know, this subject we've just been talking about with that Shaun Smith's concerned about.
Okay. I'll be happy to consider the funding of climate change measures set out in the RPP2 as part of our budget scrutiny. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I think we can keep a watching brief on this issue of the energy company obligation and Green Deal energy efficiency schemes in Scotland. I mean, that will come up in budget scrutiny, but it's something we want to keep an eye on. And we can consider Scotland's progress in meeting emissions targets when the next annual target report is produced in summer, autumn 2014. Okay, somebody agreed with that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And with that, we move into private session.